Right back to um, Pete's tweet with the spaces with uh, two links, one with the Scottish Government's human rights framework, and then one with a specific phrase from the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And I wanted to ask you, Sally, whether you've had any success in using human rights complaints in order to, uh, I guess, on two areas. One, to better force the duty to accommodate on the institution to provide clean air and to use masking. And in the second area, if possible, which is to recognize long COVID as an emerging category of disability. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, I'm really at the moment investigating the human rights possibilities around masks in healthcare, because I do think that there's some obvious issues for human rights. Whether because the threshold in some cases is very high, whether this would, it may be very clearly that there's a compromised right to life, for example, but whether that means that case law would recognize this as being sufficient, I don't know, because what is common sense and what the law means you can actually do are not necessarily related, like quite a lot of other things. On equality, we have an Equality Act here which defines disability in terms of or basically people with a sort of condition that impacts over a period of time on their, for a long period of time, on their ability to do sort of daily things, usual daily activities. And quite a lot of people with long COVID would be covered by that. Not all, for sure, but quite a lot would be. And I think there's some potential real mileage. If you are covered, you can get reasonable adjustments. And there's a legal clout to those. And if employers are shown not to have done this, for example, then you can take them to tribunal, and there's no limit to the penalty they would have to, they could be find themselves paying. So the problem is the cost of trying to take cases is potentially phenomenal, and the reality of it is it's very hard. And things like the UN Convention. I was in Geneva for the 2017, I think it was, when the last time the committee looked at what the UK States Party was doing, and the chair described it then as their record being a human catastrophe. So I'm kind of wondering what they're going to say for the next time that they look at what the UK is doing, because it's way, way worse now. So human rights are good on paper. They can be useful, but they are not easy. It's not the legal route is not an easy one. It is an important one, but it's not an easy one always.
Ziad, you wanted to come back?
Yes, if I could. I was curious whether there was any support in Scotland for interveners or for advocacy groups to join in lawsuits as parties. In Canada, there was a case that went to the Supreme Court where a disability advocacy group was recognized not just as an intervener in the application, but they were also recognized as a party. So they could continue on with the lawsuit after the disabled named plaintiffs in the lawsuit were either too sick to continue or had passed away. Because that's one of the things that happens with disability litigation is the named plaintiff is often very sick themselves, and the defendants will frustrate the process and use their own internal experts to raise the cost of the plaintiff. And so I don't know if there's any precedence in Scotland where the non-disabled plaintiff can be joined by advocacy parties who could continue the lawsuit and provide funding or just basic human energy when the disabled plaintiff runs out of gas.
I'm not aware of that. Legal systems do things in different ways, clearly. Doesn't mean that it's not possible here, but the whole sort of way it works is possibly quite different. But I'd be interested to know more about that. If you could drop me a line, just because different approaches sometimes can work. They might just not be things that we've thought about. I'm not sure that would work here, but it'd be good to know more about it. Thank you.
I'll dig out the link to the Supreme Court judgment and then add it on to the tweets I've been sending in the last couple of moments. Thanks very much for your answer, and thanks for the time, Pete and Jammer.
Thank you. That'd be great.
Yeah, you're welcome, Ziad. It doesn't look like we've got any more people coming up with questions, unless you can see with people I can't, because that sometimes happens as well.
There was one, but it dropped out. I don't see any new ones. So, yeah, no.
Sally, one of the things we were talking about is like this inclusive new normal that you're creating. Do you think it has wider applications and implications?
Oh yeah. Yeah, definitely. I mean, basically what I want to do is drive forward the learning. But it's also about joining, because so much of the learning that came about through COVID, that arose because of that, has wider application. And some of it's really obvious, but again, the dots aren't being joined. So things around sort of air filtration, clean air, and climate and pollution type issues. That's really important. But where are the dots being joined? Because they certainly aren't being joined here. It is about implications for what does it mean for I've talked about this to some extent, things like employment practices and health and safety, and why would employers any employers want their workers off sick all the time, right? I mean, it just doesn't compute, does it? So it's about, well, what does that mean for employment practice? What does it mean for equality? Is this a reasonable adjustment? You have to rethink it. Are there new equality groups being formed? This fault line we talked about, I think somebody talked about this protected, group, measure that only the people who are at risk would special stuff for them. Instantly, you've got a societal fault line, a them and an us. It's how do we sort of think through all the different applications? What does it mean for building regulations? It's not just about using the law that we've got better. It's about looking at the law that should apply and the policy that should apply, and making sure it's built into it, and campaigning for, and pushing and arguing the case, because ultimately, I think my starting point, as well as possibly my ending point here, would be, basically nobody really wants to get ill, and nobody particularly wants to be responsible for making other people ill if it's relatively easy to avoid it. Employers generally don't want their employees off sick. They do want to be, reaping in the business benefits of a safe environment for their customers, surely. And there's such a strong business case. So if that's your starting point, why? It's got to work. This has got to work, because it's logical. I know logic isn't fashionable these days, but this is logical. And, and it's absolutely obvious. It's so obvious. Yet people are not seeing it, because what's happening, I think, is that the denial of COVID has somehow extended to denial of all the learning, the useful, the valuable learning that's come out. And that's what we've got to hang on to. And we've got to do the joining the dots for people. If they're not seeing it, we need to be joining those dots. And we can, because we do see it. And I just don't think that they always do. Sometimes they do and don't want to, but often they just don't.
I think one of the problems that I see is that let's talk about infection prevention and control. For one thing, there ought to be, in my opinion, just an obvious consensus. This is transmitted by the airborne route. We need to take air control measures. We need to have masks. But there are quite established and very firm views that that's wrong, that it's still spread by droplets and touch and fomites. I can't see how we get past those problems where there's no consensus, even though it's obvious what the truth is. What do you think about this?
Well, partly it's about not sort of shutting up about it, and not so much of getting change is a sort of dripping tap effect. So there's a bit of that to go on, but it's also it was about burrowing down to really what's going on. So I asked to see the advice that the Scottish government had drawn on in making its decision to remove face masks from health and social care settings and to remove that guidance. And I got my hands on it. They sent it to me as a sort of freedom information request, and it was extremely illuminating, very depressing, but illuminating. And so now I'm going back to the body that was responsible for that. I also, got an article in somewhere about the manuals they produce, which are hopeless. So the problem is that healthcare people are not being given the right guidance. So of course they if the guidance doesn't talk about airborne infections, well, they don't know about infections. They're just following the guidance because that's what they have to do. That's what they're supposed to do, and they don't know. So you've got to get back. You've kind of got to burrow away until you get to the absolute source of all the nonsense. And I may not have got there yet, but I've unearthed a few layers of nonsense to get to some of where it's starting. And then I'm going to try and get a meeting with this bunch. And I'm going to keep working with officials, and I've been to my local MSP, member of Scottish Parliament. I'm going to try, I'd love to get some parliamentary questions put down. So, can they just tell us what data they're using in order to remain vigilant and track emerging trends as they repeatedly say they're doing? So I just like to know what data they're using, because I can't really see any. They've kind of dismantled it all and no one's testing anymore. So it's stuff like that. How it's about not taking it at face value. It's about being very critical, engaging every ounce of critical faculty you can muster. And it's about talking to other people and engaging their critical faculties too. And it's about as many people, ideally as differently placed people as you can get, saying the same thing. So if you could get, I don't know, the Institute of Directors to come out saying this, or the Federation of Housing Associations, or some kind of unlikely organisation saying the same thing as, we might say, that gives it massive clout. There's all kinds of sort of tactics around that, which I think can come into play. But anyway, that's just a few thoughts.
Yeah, and in fact, this idea of keep chipping away at it and keep challenging the governments about their ideas and policies. We saw that, I think it was a Green Party politician in, I think it was Tasmania, and it was like the COVID inquiry as to how they've handled it, and the questions that she was asking, that the politicians just had nothing to come back with, because it was so obvious that she was right that they look ridiculous, and it just makes me wonder, how long can this facade hold?
Yeah,
because and I think you're right. We've got to keep chipping away, and we've also got this cultural problem, haven't we? I mean, I saw somebody in Japan, and she had put a picture of herself online saying, "Look, I'm out in the streets." She's got a 3M V-Flex mask on. She said, and nobody gives me a second look, but I posted it online, and people in the West are just being abusive to me.
Yeah.
I don't know how we get past those cultural differences either, but I don't know why I think that you can solve all of these problems.
Well, I think partly it's just about kind of knowing that. I mean, I've rocked a few boats in my time, and the time I know I'm having an impact is when powerful people start getting cross with me. And that has happened once or twice, although I've also generally had very good relations with ministers and so on. If you're having, and if you're going against, and particularly now on social media, there are risks of sticking your head above your parapet. But if a lot of people do, then there's safety in numbers, actually. And that's what we need, is the numbers. there's an awful lot of us, and in fact, there's going to be even more of us as more people get long COVID. So, we could end up being the majority at this rate, which is an interesting thought. And if we all kind of, can find ways of channeling and coming together around this, then I think we might be onto something. But you're confronting people with the logic, with the arguments. Our case, I learned years ago that what makes things change is nothing to do with the evidence, or not nothing to do with, but it isn't necessarily to do with the evidence, the best arguments, being able to show how what you're proposing better meets government's own objectives than what they are proposing. That isn't necessarily going to do it. A lot of it's about relationships. Actually, at some point, it's about finding ways not to kind of, to actually be quite, to get them on your side. It's about, if you shout at people and get angry with them, they tend to stick their fingers in their ears and not listen. So you're trying to find ways in which they can work with you, and it's about tone and style as well. But yeah, you are on social media. You are, yeah. I mean, the amount of abuse people get is just awful, and that again actually is some learning. I think something that's changed or become much worse, much more obvious in the pandemic years. That polarization and how people are manipulated, and you can see it happening. Well, I can. I don't know if other people can always. I don't think people know or see how they're being manipulated. But actually, there's stuff that's been written about this that the techniques aren't that different to ones that go back, we have centuries. They're much the same in lots of ways, just new manifestations. But they're now social media gives a whole new way to do that, and it's scary. It's scary stuff. But the more of us that do it, and the more of us that challenge it, the better and the safer we're going to be, and the more impact we're going to have. And it will be tough. Yeah, it might not get anywhere, but if you don't try, you're never going to know, are you? So you've got to have a go.
Yeah, thanks, Sally. I'm just conscious of the time. We're like an hour and 3/4 here, and there's people with hands waiting for questions, and Gemma wants to come back in. How are you fixed for time? If we made another 20 minutes, is that okay with you?
That's fine. I might get progressively less coherent. Start falling asleep because it's quite late.
Okay.
If I start rambling interminably, or even worse than I have been, by all means, I think we probably have to call a close to it. But no, that's fine.
Yeah, we'll maybe try and close on the hour. Gemma, you wanted to come in?
Oh no, thanks, Pete. Thanks. I just wanted to. I've pulled up 3 new speakers, and I just wanted to say hi. We had a couple. Keith came to join us, and he's up in Canada doing a lot of videos and campaigning for masking, and he's really been putting it out there. Sally, I'm not sure if you know Keith, but he's been doing his part. And our friend COVID Castaway is actually on my screen. They're right next to each other. Devin, he's actually, not to put him on the spot if we have time, he's been working on an RV, and he's kind of doing a little bit of a cross country, going around trying to look for lived experience for long haulers. So there are people that are he's waving, so he might be driving, but if we have a minute, maybe he can pop up. And so I just want to, not recognize everybody. I think everybody's in here, but they just popped in, and so people are trying to do their part. You just wish that we had a little more support, if you will, but people are trying. So Keith, I'm sorry, Wise had their hand up, but Sally, I just wanted to let you know about those folks.
Great. I'd like to meet them, or it'd be good to be in touch.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Right. I was just thinking in terms of one of the things that takes me back to that awful Freedom Day of Boris Johnson, with the fact that once you threw off masks and could go and hug each other in restaurants and all the rest of it, there's if for anyone who's COVID aware, it was absolutely horrendous to watch, and it's still extremely dangerous practice. And not only that, all those people who come back from celebrating go and share their newfound disease with people who are clinically vulnerable back home and all the rest of it. So it is truly a disaster. But many of you will probably be aware of this Apple Tree Cafe somewhere in Canada, which is supposedly totally COVID safe, or as near to being COVID safe as possible. I think they've probably got UVC, protection, wide spaces between the tables, plenty of fresh air blowing through, and so on. And presumably all people are waiting tables are masked and so on. So technically, restaurants can be safe. I have no idea whether Apple Tree Cafe have proved themselves or not. But that would be one example of a high street business which actually did COVID safe practice. Obviously, we would. This is going beyond the initial demands that Dr. Sally was talking about, just getting it into healthcare. But when you look at on a budgetary level, and you see that at the moment the government is pretending that everything is very tight and they can't pay workers, and if you're going to pay Paul, you've got to rob Peter or whatever. There are plenty of economists who say this is rubbish. That when things are actually wanted by the government, they can use QE or whatever to achieve it. And we saw this obviously at the height of the pandemic, when during the furlough, where people, the government spent God knows how many hundreds of billions to put some money in workers' pockets when they couldn't work. So the point of this is that technically there's no reason why government can't dig in its pockets to make businesses safe, and that means the government subsidizing businesses to make them safe. And this is the issue. If you can imagine that you had a government that actually gave a shit and was prepared to subsidize businesses, then we could have a situation where people who are clinically vulnerable could stipulate what they need to see happen to a business, so that it is no longer a threat to them, that it's a safe business to use. And then they could have prototypes of that kind of business. They could try it out, and if the prototypes appear to work, they could spread it out, and it could become just an accepted thing, and that would mean obviously lots of redesign work on a lot of businesses, the way that they're organized and so on. And I think that would be a huge liberation for clinically vulnerable people. I just wondered what you thought. Is this an area where someone like you, Dr. Sally, with your connections and things, can push at the door there to try to create prototypes? Because